as we remember the past, as we celebrate what's happening among us, and also give thanks for the promise that is to come.
Foundry United Methodist Church proudly celebrates its 200 years of history in the heart of Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. That is 2 centuries of making disciples of Jesus Christ, of loving God, loving people, and seeking to change the world. But at the dawn of this century, Foundry's members awoke to a long-forgotten memory, an unresolved legacy of racism from its early history. They sought to repent for that shameful history, to be reconciled, and to reconnect with Asbury United Methodist, a church born from the exodus of Foundry's earliest black members. Here is that still unfolding story. Foundry Methodist Episcopal Church was built from 1814 to 1815 on land given by businessman and lay preacher Henry Foxall. African Americans, both free and slave, were among the first members. They helped establish Foundry like dozens of other early Methodist congregations. They were drawn to the principle established by John Wesley that Methodist churches, like God's saving grace, were open to all, black and white, free and slave, rich and poor. Blacks comprised nearly half of Foundry's membership, but African Americans here and elsewhere were forced to sit apart in crowded balconies and to pray and to receive communion separately. They were not allowed to serve as clergy or lay leaders or ushers, nor sing in the choir, nor serve communion.
The problem became as the church moved and grew, particularly towards the South, there was a confusion of what to do with the Negro, as they were called. This became problematic in many fronts. Pastors who were outstanding preachers were not allowed to be credentialed. That was one of the things that started at Foundry. Was people wanted not just to be participating, but wanted to have some status themselves, to be on boards and committees and being officers and so forth. This was true throughout the whole denomination, where they were welcome on one hand, but pushed down on the other hand.
I shall be free someday.
When black members of early biracial Methodist churches in the North had suffered racism, repression, and rejection long enough, they left to establish their own congregations. These new pioneering black congregations remained affiliated with and initially controlled by their white parent churches, but other black Methodists broke away completely to form or join their own independent African Methodist denominations. At Foundry, black members tolerated second-class treatment for 2 decades, finding ways to address their spiritual needs. In 1829, John F. Cook and Superintendent Benjamin McCoy established the Asbury Sunday School to offer Christian nurture to their people. In 1833, Eli Nugent became the first of Foundry's black members to earn an exhorter's license and then deacons and elders' orders. Soon black members began meeting and worshiping in members' homes.
By 1834, when there were a very substantial number of African Americans decided that they would really need to be independent and separate. And for the next 10 years, Foundry helped them leave, and a new building was built.
They organized the Asbury Aid Society in January 1836. By October, Foundry's trustees had purchased property on behalf of the black members for $300. About 75 black members erected a frame building there and dedicated it as Asbury Chapel.
it was still considered by the conference to be a part of Foundry. And it was served by pastors, associate ministers on the staff of Foundry, who were white, serving as pastors of Asbury. By 1856, the Asbury people really wanted to be their own church. And so that was done. The history of Asbury Church took off on its own way, as did Foundry. Well, both those churches through the years have prospered.
Although still led by white pastors, Asbury did become an independent Methodist Episcopal church by 1856. But the years before and during the Civil War were tough on many black Americans living in the nation's capital. The growing population of free black residents, along with slave rebellions elsewhere, ignited fears among whites. They enforced repressive laws known as the Black Codes. Meanwhile, abolitionists were gaining ground, which angered supporters of slavery. That anger erupted in a destructive outburst in 1835, known as the Snowstorm Riot. A young slave, intoxicated and upset about his bondage, allegedly threatened his white female owner. He was arrested and prosecuted, but angry white mobs unleashed a torrent of vengeance against black city residents. They destroyed black-owned homes, churches, and businesses, including a popular tavern owned and operated by a successful black businessman named Beverly Snow. More rioting by pro-slavery mobs followed in 1848, when a group of slaves tried to escape. They hid on a small vessel named the Pearl, but they were caught and sold, and among them were 2 mulatto girls who were members of Asbury.
We were involved with the story about the Pearl, escaping the Pearl, where 75 blacks tried to escape slavery in D.C., and we, the father of Paul Edmondson had 2 girls, 2 daughters among the 13 children that they had, Mary and Emily, who were convinced by their 2 brothers to go with them, and the parents agreed to let them go on this ship to escape the horrors of slavery.
One early night, some good friends, some good Christian folk who believed in freedom arranged for a ship called the Pearl to take people away to freedom, and 6 of my children got on that boat. 6 of my children went away. God help me. Came to a bad end.
They ran into a rainstorm and they had to stop. They couldn't carry on. The citizens who owned some of the slaves, all the slaves really in Washington, were furious. And so they, the next morning, Sunday morning, they want to know what in the world, where's Johnny, where's Mary, where's Emily? They were brought back and marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. The 2 young ladies became a cause célèbre because they were going to send them down south to become prostitutes.
Sold to a slave trader in Alexandria, Virginia, the 2 sisters were hired out to work by day and imprisoned at night. Their father, Paul Edmondson, was a free man, but his wife Amelia was a slave, which by law made their children slaves, except for those who had bought their own freedom. The family sought help from Asbury and other churches near and far. Abolitionist and pastor Henry Ward Beecher was the brother of famed author Harriet Beecher Stowe. His Congregational Church in New York raised the needed funds to buy the 2 sisters freedom. Mary and Emily went on to attend schools and join Beecher in the growing campaign to abolish slavery.
Good Christian folk, good Methodist folk, who believe in the right, who believe that freedom is for all.
Yes. Oh, yes.
They helped me.
Oh, yes.
They helped me to bring my babies home. For those who believe in the right, for those who believe in freedom, those who believe in Jesus. Amen.
In 1844, Southern Methodists split away from the Methodist Episcopal Church because of its official stance against slavery. They formed the Methodist Episcopal Church South, but Foundry chose to remain in the Northern Church. In fact, it supported the American Colonization Society, a popular movement to buy and return slaves to Africa. But by the end of slavery in 1865, many African Americans had found freedom and self-determination right here in America, and so did many of their churches. For 12 long years, black clergy had petitioned the Methodist Church for the right to lead their own congregations and to organize their own annual conferences, where they could manage their own affairs with dignity. Finally, in 1864, their petition was approved. Asbury Church received its first black pastor, James Peck, and 2 all-black annual conferences were organized. The Washington Conference for African American churches in Washington and parts of Maryland and Virginia, and the Delaware Conference for black churches farther north.
This gave Asbury the strength to develop and grow because now they could claim they had their own autonomy. And this was duplicated across the whole church. And so the Foundry and Asbury piece on the one hand was problematic, but the release of that made it possible for the two eventually to have a better working relationship.
By then, however, some impatient Asbury members had left the denomination to establish other churches in D.C., including John Wesley African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Methodism in America remained racially divided, with 3 all-black denominations and the all-white Methodist Episcopal Church South. Asbury itself developed quickly, led by a succession of distinguished African American pastors. Asbury housed some of D.C.'s first schools for black children and adults, and was renowned for having outstanding preaching, music, and Christian education. It also provided civic leadership and lobbying for equal rights for African Americans. Foundry flourished as well, growing in size and mission. It too could boast of renowned preachers, worship revivals, and Sunday schools, as well as prominent members. Leaders of the 2 churches served the needs of the city's poor by establishing a training school for deaconesses and missionaries, and also Sibley Memorial Hospital, which opened in 1894 and was valued for uniquely serving all races and ethnic groups. Foundry also promoted temperance from alcohol and tobacco, cared for orphans, youth, and the elderly, helped establish American University, and engaged broadly in worldwide missions. Asbury, meanwhile, welcomed to D.C. part of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, and it responded to the growing poverty and injustice they faced in their new home. A century after its birth, Asbury was thriving. It numbered over 2,400 members, including prominent black leaders like educator and civil rights advocate Mary McLeod Bethune.
I remember Asbury used to be so crowded. It used to be crowded. Easter Sunday, you had to get chairs put all up and down the aisles. The balcony was packed in. People shoulder to shoulder. Asbury was considered one of the prominent churches in D.C. There's a lot of people you talk to here today or gone on, and they used to say that when they left home, the parents or someone said, make sure you go to Asbury.
By the 1960s, the Methodist Church was mirroring the nation's long overdue civil rights progress as church agencies and annual conferences finally began to desegregate. The racially separated Baltimore and Washington annual conferences were among the first to merge in 1965. And in 1968, the segregated all-black central jurisdiction was abolished. Although historically related and located just blocks apart, Foundry and Asbury had belonged to 2 racially separated annual conferences and jurisdictions. They were virtually strangers in the household of God. And now, for the first time in a century, they would once again be members of the same annual conference, the same jurisdiction, the same church family. Foundry began making its own racial progress primarily in the 1960s, with the long-serving Dr. Edward Bauman as lead pastor. The church integrated its child development program, its worship services, ministries, community outreach, and finally, its membership. Norman and Frances Prince joined in 1965 because they loved Foundry's extraordinary music. But welcoming them as the church's first full African-American members was also an answer to Ed Bauman's prayers.
Dr. Bauman had a dinner at his house for all of the candidates for membership. And we found out at that time, he said there's going to be some trouble here at Foundry maybe, because we would be the first African Americans accepted to membership during the modern times. And we were completely innocent to this. We were completely shocked. He even mentioned that that there was a rumor out that the NAACP had sent us here to integrate Foundry. We were just shocked because we had seen African Americans in the congregation and all. But we found out later that they were associate members, not really bona fide members of the congregation.
More African Americans would join Foundry and even become leaders. William Astor Kirk and Vivian Kirk joined in 1981 after a long distinguished history of advocating for racial equality and inclusion in the United Methodist Church. In the 1960s, Kirk led the crafting of a strategic plan to desegregate the denomination. 2 decades later, while living in Washington, the Kirks moved their membership from an all-black church to Foundry.
For my dad, basically it was, why do you fight either formal or informal segregation, and then once it's open, and then you voluntarily get involved in going to a predominantly African American church, or if you're white, go to a predominantly white church. So to him, I think it was part of his stewardship to say, look, I'm not going to do that. And I think he knew of Foundry. Foundry has a unique history in the United Methodist Church. And so I think he was attracted to come here, and they plunged themselves into the life of this church at the time.
Ralph Williams became Foundry's first black lay leader in 2001, and the church also welcomed several black clergy to its pastoral staff.
Having been part of the leadership of the church, though, I know that there has been a discussion about diversity in the congregation for a long period of time, and there has been an active attempt to integrate both the choir and the pulpit. Racial reconciliation is hard work, and you've got to go through the work to get to the reconciliation. And we're still doing the work.
Yet while numerous racial barriers had fallen, there were still racial bridges to be built, historical divides to be crossed, and long-neglected wounds to be healed. The United Methodist General Conference in 2000 provided the impetus for cross-racial bridge building. In a service of repentance, the worldwide legislative body urged predominantly white churches in the U.S. to reach out to black churches, especially those of the African American Methodist denominations, and seek to heal wounds of historical racism. A study resource was published to help churches examine denominational racism and to seek reconciliation and forgiveness. It was aptly titled Steps Toward Wholeness. Meanwhile, Foundry's Committee on Religion, Race, and Culture had succeeded by 1995 in helping the church to become a reconciling congregation, welcoming lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered persons in Christian love and discipleship. Now they sought to forge understanding and reconciliation in matters of race. Millie Brobston joined the committee after attending a workshop where she learned about institutional racism, exclusion, and white privilege.
I went to the committee meetings and started kind of bringing this up, and I remember I had this moment where I gave Reverend Nancy Webb a ride home because, she didn't drive. And in the car I was saying, seems like this committee isn't doing much on race. And I remember we had this, just kind of a, kindred spirits moment where she's like, yeah, And so we thought, well, let's do something about that. And so we kind of started bringing it up in the committee, and we also started recruiting new people to the committee. And so over time, the makeup of the committee changed and the focus of the committee changed. So we began to just get motivated and get people excited about that. And one thing we did is we hosted the Africans in America PBS series So we did a 4-series of showing that video and having a discussion. We did activities with the children in the Sunday school. We did a puppet show. We did activities with the junior high and senior high. We did a class. And then we did an adult forum series. We did a book review, kind of looking at African American authors. We also went to visit the Underground Railroad stops down in Alexandria. We did a joint activity with the gay, lesbian, bisexual group to Antietam Battlefield and learned about that history. We also went to Harper's Ferry where John Brown raid happened. There was just kind of a whole series of events that were happening that I think we were kind of building the momentum.
An Undoing Racism workshop challenged committee members to look deeper. And in their quest to learn more about the sin of racism, they looked within. In examining Foundry's own history, they discovered the racial oppression that led Foundry's early black members to leave and start their own church. They decided to reach out to their estranged daughter church in search of reconciliation and reconnection.
Because we were founded out of Foundry, there was a group of folks who came over after church, came over for church, and then after church we had a meeting, and they wanted to ask us about participating in their anniversary. And the meeting started off horribly, just absolutely horribly, mainly because there was a white assistant pastor at Foundry, and he had a photo of Asbury's original chapel.
And other literature.
And other literature.
Yeah.
And so